When I reviewed the VW ID.3, I found it to be one of the best all-electric hatchbacks that you can find currently on the market. Now I've got the VW ID.4, its larger sibling, and it also comes with a little bit more of a premium price tag. In the UK it can be found for around £41,000, which makes it a cool £10,000 more expensive than its VW ID.3 counterpart. Now in this review we're going to be seeing if the ID.4 is worth your money, specifically in comparison to other all-electric SUVs on the market, and furthermore how it compares to its smaller sibling. Now if you'd like a detailed comparison between the different trim levels that are on offer with the ID.4 and some of the competitors, do check out our written review, will be down in the description below. Also down there you'll find links to our social media platforms, so we'd very much appreciate a follow if you use, let's say, Instagram or Twitter. So to kick things off, let's talk about its exterior design. And while I wasn't exactly taken or sold with the ID.3, I do think the ID.4 just has got a larger and just a little bit more of a presence on the road, not only because it is an SUV versus a hatchback, but I do quite like what VW have achieved over here. From the front you've got a slightly cut off look, and it's almost reminiscent of the VW of yesteryear, in other words, let's say the VW wagons. As for the side profile, you're treated with plastic wheel arches and plastic side skirts, but as they don't protrude from the vehicle, I think they do blend in quite well. You also do have 18-inch alloys that come as standard. In our model, which is the first edition, you do get 20-inch alloys. There is also 19-inch alloys as well that can be purchased as an additional option. Now elsewhere, I do quite like what VW have achieved with the door handles. I know this might seem quite trivial, however it's done for aerodynamic efficiency and therefore it doesn't kind of protrude from the vehicle, yet again in order to improve, let's say, the drag coefficient. However, unlike normal vehicles where you kind of have to pull the handle out, it's just a button that you press underneath and kind of releases the door latch, and it's not as unintuitive as the likes of, let's say, the Tesla, where you kind of have to press it and pull at the same time. So I just like what Volkswagen have done over here. As for the rear of the vehicle, it's also fitting with the rest of the vehicle's design, and furthermore I do like how Volkswagen have stretched the tail light from one end to the other, so therefore it just looks a little bit more premium and tech focused. And yet again you've kind of got a cut off look, which to me reminds me of the Touareg or even the T-Roc that Volkswagen offer. And so now we get onto the interior of the vehicle, which has a lot of similarities with the ID.3. Now first off, I do like the upholstery that Volkswagen has used. It's got a velour micro fleece material which stretches at the front and at the rear of the cabin. Not only does this feel nice, but it also looks it, and I do like the colour combination that the manufacturer has opted for. As for the dashboard, it's got a relatively nice design, and I also do like the fact that the inner door bins are all lined, so therefore you're not going to have, let's say, loose change dangling about when you're on the motorway. Now as for the front of the cabin, there are some things to like and dislike. I'm definitely going to get it out of my chest, but the instrument cluster itself is very vivid and I really like it, and the fact that you can adjust it via these sliders found on the steering wheel makes for just a likened experience. I further like the fact that when you do have Android Auto, at least when I tested it via Google Maps, it integrates that data on your instrument cluster as well, which means you don't have to take your eyes off the road. Furthermore, if you go for the Max trim, you do have the option of having a head-up display as well, which will further bolster in terms of your overall safety credentials, because you're keeping your eyes more planted on the road, but also will just make you feel a little bit more technologically advanced. Now there is a gear selector on the right hand side of the instrument cluster. It does take a little bit getting used to. It's very similar to the ID.3 and of course the BMW i3, but once you get your head around it, then it becomes second nature. Now as for the steering wheel itself, it's very easy to grip. It's made of a nice material as well, and the buttons on them are haptic feedback, so therefore you do have a slight touch feeling when you are swaying between different options, or let's say pressing in terms of adjusting your volume. Again, it does take a little bit getting used to in comparison to regular buttons, but I've got no major complaints over here. The problem, however, stems at the center of the vehicle, where you've got no physical buttons and knobs. Instead, you've got a capacitive touch slider which is found just underneath the 10-inch display, and this allows you to adjust the climate or adjust the overall media volume, which can be a little bit cumbersome, specifically if you have wet hands or fingers, or let's say you're wearing gloves which don't have touch sensitive input, and therefore means that it's just a little bit less intuitive. Now as for the infotainment system itself, it can be upgraded to a 12-inch display. If you have the max trim, in our model it's got a 10-inch display, and to me that's pretty much large enough. Furthermore, it's got multi-touch input. It supports Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, as you might have already gathered, and also wireless Apple CarPlay as well, which further increases in terms of usability. And it's very vivid, and it's also very slightly angled towards the driver, which makes it a little bit more intuitive when it comes to controlling certain functions. Now, on the subject of technology, for you to connect up to the infotainment system, you can use Bluetooth, or you can opt for a wired connection, and here you've got two Type-C ports found underneath a small compartment at the center console. There's also two further Type-C ports at the rear of the center console for rear occupants to charge their devices. Now here you do have music at your disposal, unsurprisingly, in any vehicle, and in the ID.4 you are treated with 6 speakers. As far as I'm aware, at the time of making this video, there's no way of actually upgrading the system, and therefore you've got 4 speakers at the front and 2 speakers at the rear. And yes, that's right, you do have rear speakers, which is not the same that can be said about the baseline trim of the ID.3. Now, if you'd like a detailed review of the audio system, do check it up on your pop-up banner or in the description below, where I'll go into a lot more detail about how the audio system performs. What I will say in a nutshell is that for a stock audio system in the ID.4, it definitely does impress and is definitely a step up over the stock system on the ID.3. Now, in terms of storage compartments, you do have 2 cup holders at the front of the center console. You do have that retractable bay, and you do have 2 sliders which you can kind of flip up from one side or the other depending on terms of what size goods you're taking. You do have the door compartments at the front, which are relatively large, and the glove compartment, although at the rear of the cabin it's a little bit more limited in terms of storage compartments because the rear door bins are quite small. But on the plus side, you can bring down the rear arm rest and therefore reveal 2 further cup holder spaces. Now, speaking about the rear of the cabin, it is absolutely spacious over here. I am just under 6 foot and I've got plenty of room in terms of my head, so in terms of if you're under 6'4" or maybe even 6'7" at a stretch, you'll fit comfortably. The biggest selling point is the legroom. It is absolutely large, and in my opinion, I just feel it kind of reminds me of the Audi A8L, where you can kind of recline back. I think that's pretty much the only thing missing at the rear of the cabin over here. Now, as for the storage as well, there is a little compartment bay found within the rear segment of the front seats, which allows you to potentially place a smartphone, although I can't really see the use case of that, but do let me know if it's something that you would see yourself using, or potentially your kids. Now, as for seat comfort itself, excluding the rear middle seat, which is unsurprisingly a little bit stiffer, I do find that the rear seats are also very much like the ID.3, whereby they are kind of like diagonal, so therefore your knees are a little bit higher than your waist. But unlike the ID.3, which is a little bit more crammed in, where the ID.4 you can completely extend your legs, this becomes almost a non-issue. Now, as for the front of the cabin, the 2 seats have an adjustable armrest, and furthermore the seats are heated. Although it's a shame here that you have got manually adjustable seats and not electronic seats instead. Of course, you can purchase this as an option, but as a £40,000 car, you'd expect this to come as standard. Now, a bugbear for me on the ID.3, and very much like with the ID.4, is the fact that the front driver's seat has a pressure sensor in it, and that is very much fundamental in terms of you operating the climate controls, or let's say the infotainment system. As soon as the driver steps out of the vehicle, and even if the key fob is left within the vehicle, the car will power down. And on the plus side, you can still overwrite this function by reaching around the steering column and pressing the start-stop engine button, well, start-stop engine, the start-stop motor button, shall we say, and furthermore, you can still press the on and off switch on the infotainment system. But if you're at the rear of the cabin, specifically the size of the ID.4, and specifically if you've got kids, that's not going to be something that's going to be very intuitive to do or very easy for them to actually achieve, which again just kind of emphasizes the point in terms of overall practicality. I just wish that Volkswagen had thought this through, specifically when it comes to actually using this vehicle as a family-sized car. And now we get on to the boot, which is unfortunately not electronically adjustable, at least not in the model we've got. And I do find the handle is pretty small and quite low down. As you can see, I have to reach down. So when you do unlock it, it does go up quite high, and I'm not quite in the NBA or professional basketball player, but you can see it does get pretty high. I'm just under 6 foot. Now, this does have its pros in terms of loading in goods in and out of the boot, but it does have its cons, because if you are relatively short, you'll find that reaching this handle might be a little bit too far, but of course your mileage may vary. Now, in terms of the boot capacity, you've got 543 litres at your disposal, which is absolutely massive. Now, if you were to pop down the seats, you get 1,575 litres. That, in comparison to the ID.3, compares that to 385 litres and 1,267 litres respectively. So therefore, if space is very much something that you're looking for in terms of transporting goods, then the ID.4 is definitely a better pick. Now, I really do love the fact that Volkswagen have integrated underfloor storage compartment, which means that you can conveniently transport your charging cables, or let's say some other goods if you have them and you don't want to take your charging cables with you. This wasn't the case with the ID.3, so it's nice to see that is actually integrated with this vehicle. Now, as for practicality, the seats can be brought down, and it's nice to see that the middle compartment can be brought down independently, so therefore if you've got a pair of skis, you can take them while still transporting 4 passengers, well, including yourself, in terms of 4 occupants, should I say. And for the seats themselves, they can be brought down as well, so therefore you've got 2 adjustments over here. Now, the only thing to mention over here is that you do have to go around to the rear seat in order to release the latch, because there's no kind of lever found at the boot, which would make it a little bit more convenient. Now, for the boot itself, you do have a 12-volt socket, you do have fixing points as well, which makes it a little bit easier if you're transporting larger size goods and you don't want them flailing around in the boot. And furthermore, in terms of transporting goods, it is worth bearing in mind that you do have a slightly raised boot lip, although it is protected by plastic, so therefore you're not going to damage your paint. Elsewhere, the boot floor isn't flat, which is quite a shame. There is a relatively large step between the rear segment of the rear seats and the rear segment of the boot floor, so therefore it's not quite flat, and it would have been nice to see VW address this in the ID.4, but alas, that's not the case. And now we get on to driving, and as we're on some country roads and it's an absolute beautiful day out in the UK, let's get on to talk about the driving experience. So first off, cabin noise. Now, the ID.4 is actually pretty well insulated. The tyres that we've got over here, and the rims, should I say, they're 20-inch rims, and you'd normally expect relatively large-sized rims to induce quite a lot of road noise, but that's not the case with the ID.4, and it actually took me by surprise. But on the flip side, when it comes to handling characteristics, the ID.4 just doesn't feel as nice as the ID.3, which really has... Here's a little pheasant on the road. Off you go, little fella. The ID.3 just feels a little bit nicer on the road, and it feels a little bit more planted for those who are accustomed to, let's say, the VW Golf. And as I referenced many times in that review, that the ID.3 just felt like a better driving experience, where the same couldn't be quite said about the ID.4, where I feel that the car has a little bit of extra body roll, which shouldn't be overly surprising given the fact that we are at a higher platform and we're talking about a different class of vehicle. But I was just expecting this car to have the same sort of handling characteristics and almost a driver's feel. The same could be said about the steering wheel, which even in its sports setting feels just a little bit numb. It just doesn't feel to be as responsive, and as a result, if you're going around country roads at speed, you're definitely going to have to cater for that extra, well, almost like that numbness that you get on the steering wheel, which is just quite a shame. Now, in terms of the drive system, the ID.4, very much like the ID.3, at least the base ID.3 that is, it has a rear-wheel drive system. And here it means that the power is delivered from the rear axle, because that's where the motor is placed, and you're getting quite a decent amount of grunt. More specifically, you're getting around 150 kilowatts of power, which is literally identical to the ID.3, and that equates to around 201 horsepower. Now, if you're going to be launching to 60 miles an hour, what you'll find is here the motor, very much like the ID.3, dispatches around 310 newton meters of torque, which from my tests using the RaceLogic's V-Box Sport, that got me from a standstill to 60 miles an hour in a tested 7.31 seconds, which is plenty impressive for a car of its size, although it won't be as nippy as the ID.3, but that shouldn't really come as much surprise given the ID.4 is again a different class of vehicle and furthermore weighs roughly 330 kilograms more than its smaller sibling. Now as for the top speed, specifically those who are going to be driving on the German Autobahn, the ID.4 is limited to 99 miles an hour, which isn't overly surprising, although it would have potentially been nice to see given the fact that the car has a bigger sized battery to be not say unlimited, but to be not say as limited to 99 miles an hour. But for most of us out there in the UK and of course across Europe, 99 miles an hour will definitely suffice. Now I did reference in terms of its battery pack, and yes indeed it has a 77 kilowatt hour battery which is planted at the underfloor of the vehicle. Now this does give it perfect 50-50 weight distribution, although as I mentioned before in terms of handling characteristics it doesn't feel as well planted as the ID.3. Now the ID.3 as standard comes with a 58 kilowatt hour battery pack, although that can be upgraded to a 77 kilowatt hour battery pack like you'd find in the ID.4. Now given the extra real estate that you've got in the battery pack, one might expect better range, and indeed VW claim to have around 310 to 320 miles on the WLTP test cycle, but from my tests I saw this figure to be hovering around 260 miles, which is definitely an improvement over the ID.3, there's no doubt about it, where the ID.3 scored around 230 miles in our mixed driving test, which is very much what we're doing here on the ID.4. However, I was just expecting just a little bit more. It could be the fact that the vehicle is slightly larger, slightly heavier, and of course Sports has a bigger battery pack, but potentially one might have expected the ID.4 to be pushing the 300 mile boundary. Now don't get me wrong, this is on our mixed driving test with the climate controls on, the infotainment system blazing out, and driving around the country roads, motorway and around the city. If you were to drive quite economically, then what you'll find is on the city you might exceed that 300 mile mark, but of course your mileage may vary. So given our controlled benchmarks, what I can say is that yes, the ID.4 does score better than the ID.3, however isn't exactly a night and day difference where that 30 miles isn't going to really set aside for those people who want a bigger battery pack and therefore want to go the distance. Now I should also mention the ID.4 does come in a pure format, and that's going to be available quite soon, and that comes with a 52 kilowatt hour battery pack which has a claimed WLTP range of around 210 odd miles. So in this respect you can probably expect the pure variant to be hitting roughly around 180 miles, although I haven't tested that model, and given the fact that it is probably lighter than the 77 kilowatt hour battery pack variant that we have on review over here, you might actually net a little bit of better mileage. But do share your experiences in the comment section below, depending on which model you have and of course which model you've actually tested yourselves. Now very much on the note of battery and efficiency, the ID.4 very much like the ID.3 has a B mode which can be initiated by flicking up on the gear selector found by the instrument cluster. Now very much like the ID.3, I'm not too fond of it. One, because it's not that harsh, so you can't really have a one pedal driving approach. I'd be surprised if you can, to be quite honest with you. Although on faster roads you do notice the car does decelerate with B mode on, so there's no doubt about it, it's actually operating. However, I would have liked some customization, and given the fact we are talking about an all-electric vehicle which has been based on Volkswagen's own all-electric platform, one might have expected the vehicle to be just a little bit more tailored for EV driving, like you'd see on the likes of, let's say, the Nissan Leaf, or let's say the Hyundai Kona Electric and the Kia e-Niro, which both of these all-electric SUVs have a variety of different modes for you to choose from, and therefore to tailor your own driving experience. And they do have a little bit more of a harsher regenerative braking method should you wish to use it, so that you can not only be a little bit more efficient and recoup energy back into the battery pack, but also for you to effectively have a bit better of a one pedal driving approach. Now, being an all-electric vehicle, you can of course plug it in order to recoup energy a little bit more efficiently. Now here Volkswagen integrate both the CCS and Type 2 ports, and whereby here via the CCS port you can expect a input charge of up to 125 kilowatts, which means you can go from roughly around 0 to 80% in around 38 minutes, which should be pretty quick for a lot of people, specifically if you're on the motorway. If, however, you're going to use a Type 2 port, well, they expect this figure to be upwards of 10 hours, whereby that'll get you from 0 to 100% via a 7 kilowatt charger. Now, this does have an 11 kilowatt onboard charger as well, so therefore if you do have access to a 3-phase power supply at home or at, let's say, a workplace charger, then you can bring this time down just a little bit lower. Now, another very important factor specifically for consumers of the ID.4, because there might be families out there looking to get this vehicle, is its safety credentials. Now here, the vehicle scored 5 out of 5 stars on Euro NCAP's pretty rigorous tests, which means that it's going to be very safe on a serious accident, but hopefully no one has to go through such a trauma. And as a result, you will be a little bit interested to know about the driver systems that are at your disposal and things that you might be seeing on a day-to-day basis. First off, we've got adaptive cruise control, and here I do find it does work relatively well, whereby it picks up the car in front of you and accelerates or decelerates you on the go and allows you to have a little bit of an easier drive when you're going on longer mundane motorway trips. But on the flip side, I do find that at times it was picking up road signs on slip roads. So for example, if you're driving on the motorway at 50 miles an hour or 70 miles an hour, it'll pick up a slip road sign of 30 or 20 and then try to decelerate you as a result, which isn't exactly what you want, nor will the person behind you want to see when they're suddenly kind of decelerating. Now, on that notion, I do also find that the lane assistance is a little bit primitive, whereby the vehicle will give you a gentle swerve if you're going off-piste, but isn't going to give you steering support, whereby it's going to adaptively and consistently try and keep you at the center of the lane intelligently, which you might see on some more advanced systems that are on offer from the likes of Audi, which is part of the Volkswagen group. So it's a shame not to see such a system in a £40,000 car, and I must say, in terms of lane assistance, it's very much like a bugbear of the ID.3, whereby if you don't want to use it, and specifically if you're someone who lives on the country roads or near on the countryside, then lane assistance is going to be enabled each time you step a foot inside the car. So therefore, if you don't like it, you're going to have to manually disable it each time you want to set off on a drive, which is something I had to do when I was on country roads because I didn't like the system being utilized, and truthfully sometimes was a little bit hit and miss. Whereas on the motorway, I don't mind it being activated because it just gives me a little bit more of a knowledge that the car is looking after me and my well-being while I'm on pretty straight roads. Now, elsewhere, when it comes to safety, there is of course visibility, and here the vehicle has got fantastic visibility at the front, where a relatively large windshield and a small-ish bonnet means that it's quite easy to peer off and see your surroundings. Of course, you do have to get used to an SUV if you're accustomed to a hatchback, but once you get used to your spatial awareness, what you'll find that it becomes somewhat second nature. Now, elsewhere, I should mention in terms of the visibility around the side, specifically on the side view mirrors or the rear view mirrors, they're actually really excellent. The large windows that you have on either side make it very easy for you to peer across. And that was the emergency system thinking I was going to crash into that car. So kind of talking about the safety, it's almost like the car can hear me. But anyway, you can see I was nowhere going to hit that car, but it picked up that there is an object and I'm not slowing down because I was just going to be veering off, but it didn't see my input there. So anyway, that's quite good content right there at the same time. Now, when it comes to the actual visibility, I should say that at the rear, it's a little bit more limited. It's not quite as wide as the likes of the VW ID.3. And as a result, it means that when it comes to parking, you do have to look out for your surroundings a little bit more. And furthermore, a rear view camera doesn't come as standard and instead is an option on the higher level trims. It's quite a shame, yet again, like the ID.3, not to see this included as standard. And specifically here, we're talking about a £41,000 car. You would expect it to come within the vehicle, even at its base level trim. Now on the plus side, you do have front and rear parking sensors, so it might give you a little bit more of a peace of mind for you not hitting, let's say, a bollard on a parking lot, or for example a wall if you're reversing. Furthermore, it's also disappointing to see there's no blind spot monitoring system, and that doesn't even come on as an option. It's just flat out not available, at least not from what I researched and what I could see on Volkswagen's website if you were to purchase the ID.4. And as a result, it means you have to do the traditional way, so to speak, and look over your shoulder, which is fine, but for a car that's around £40,000, you might expect it to come as standard, let alone even have it as potentially as an option for those people who just want the blind spot monitoring system. And that can be very useful in and around cities where you've got, let's say, cyclists or motorbikes, and you might have not seen them because they're coming quite fast, and to have a little visual indication at the side view of your mirrors, for example. So again, it's a shame that Volkswagen hasn't integrated this, and one yet again might expect it to come as standard, or at the very least as an option on a £40,000 vehicle. And so this all leads me on to my verdict. What do I make about the VW ID.4? Well, quite frankly, it's not as impressive as the ID.3. Maybe I set my expectations a little bit too high, because the ID.3 delivers a really fun driving experience, and fundamentally from its 58 kilowatt hour battery pack delivers up to 230 miles of range. Of course, your mileage may vary, whereas the ID.4 has a larger battery pack at 77 kilowatts hour, and here it only dispatches around 260 miles in very much the same conditions and the same tests. So as a result, you might want to consider getting the ID.3, or if you're looking to get an SUV, then you should definitely look at the Kia e-Niro or the Hyundai Kona Electric, which are both fantastic alternatives that come in at a cheaper price and give you pretty much the same amount of all-electric range. But of course, that's just my opinions and thoughts about it, so I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. And of course, if you like this video, give it a like, subscribe and hit that bell notification to keep up with the channel. Now, if you feel that this video will be helpful to a family and friend making an informed purchasing decision, then definitely do share it with them. Alright, I've been Chris from TotallyEV. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.